Well, we've certainly had a remarkable award ceremony, and being here in Vienna with such distinguished people serving our God on different scenes, but together for the big issues. And now we're going to have a little discussion, a conversational discussion between, in my mind, two of the great leaders of Christian legal service in the world, and they happen to be in Europe. And number one is the award laureate from ADF, Paul Coleman, and for today it's number two, our previous award laureate from 2018, Jerzy Kwaśniewski of Ordo Iuris. The two of you, of course, have impeccable service for people and for the kingdom of God and to our values. Let me ask you first, is there anything you would like to add to your speech previously, Paul Coleman?
I think one thing maybe I'll just add very briefly before turning over to Jerzy is I focused in my remarks as a legal advocacy organization on some of the legal challenges affecting the family in Europe, across the Western world. So maybe I add 2 minutes just to put a footnote on that as well, which is simply to say, of course, as a lawyer, I know that the challenges affecting the family are not only legal in nature, and I think that's important to note because, in fact, they go much deeper and they're much broader than simply or because a bad law was passed or because a bad political party was in power or a bad decision of the courts was made. It would be easy to think, that's the problem or the only problem, but in fact that's simply one of several. And I think we have to recognize before we can even talk about how do we work on some of these challenges, how do we even look to solve some of them, that it's not just legal in nature. And in particular, we have a societal or a cultural challenge when it comes to marriage and the family. And this has often been said, but long before the concept of redefining marriage hit the mainstream in Western Europe, marriage had already been significantly watered down through extremely high divorce rates, no-fault divorce being introduced, from the very concept of marriage and the family being disregarded or held in low esteem across the West. And that's only accelerated and continued through to the present day. I was reminded of this 2 days ago in the UK. Many of you might have seen our Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was forced to resign. And the reason was he is married, has 3 children, and was caught on camera having an affair with his aide. And what was striking about it is the reason for his resignation was not the affair. It was because he broke social distancing rules. And the reporting, almost universally, across all different political spectrum, as the newspapers sort of align across the left and the right, centrist, what have you, pretty much everyone said the same thing, which was, we don't care that a government minister was having an affair. That's who cares about that? What we care about is that he's a hypocrite. That's, I think even there was a headline of one article that said, Hancock's real sin is not adultery, it's hypocrisy. And this has sort of just been universally accepted now as truth. Yeah, we don't care about that. All we care about is the social distancing. And I think it's just one of many examples or illustrations of how within broader society, we have just completely lost touch with or no longer desire strong, stable, robust, natural family units. And so the legal challenges that we face cannot be separated from these, the erosion of the concept of marriage and the family within the broader culture, within the broader society. And then related to that, I'd say a third area, let's say, since we all come from different Christian denominations, is what I would consider to be a failure within the church at large, not one person or one denomination, but a failure of the church at large to be able to properly teach, explain, and set a vision for, a positive vision for marriage and the family within church and within society. Considering that marriage is introduced as a concept in the opening chapter of Genesis and then runs through to the very end of Revelation, it's incredible how little it is spoken about from the pulpit, from within the churches. It's incredible how little teaching there is on this for young people facing all of these challenges in the classroom or the university. So I'll leave it there, just to what I would say set up the challenges before us for discussion. On the one hand, we have this legal, which I've already touched on. We have a societal, cultural challenge. And then, particularly for those of us from Christian dominations, we have the challenge within the church itself, what I consider to be a failure to present and represent a positive vision for society. So that's all the challenges as I see them.
Well, thank you, Paul. And then going over from the Protestant to the Catholic, Jerzy Kwaśniewski. What's the challenge? What do you see, Jerzy?
That was a very good point about the role of the Christian communities in Europe. Because what we observe now in all the denominations, Catholic Church, Protestant communities, that many of our communities give up their role to change the society, to promote natural family, to promote marriage, to promote natural rights that are guaranteeing the basic structure of the society. And it is where after Enlightenment, after Voltaire, Austin, Lauterpacht, the working lawyers are taking over the clergy. And it is the legal profession mission now to raise the cases as the evidence of basic rights. And that's what we are doing now, raising precedent cases on both domestic and international level to picture these very important processes that are going on in the society and the far end and the effects of crumbling, of destroying of the family, of the natural family, of natural marriage, where it all goes, where we are going to. And when we are raising issues of families being targeted by child protection services in some countries of Europe, that are child protection services that are overusing their powers, and when we are showing very specific family, very specific child, very specific children that are persecuted because of their faith, because of their ethnic identity, it is a way now that as lawyers, we became missionaries. Missionaries of natural society, of natural rights, of human rights. Because it was very important in the speech of Paul that those natural rights are human rights. It was the idea behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 70 years ago, to invoke the general idea of natural law in a world where not everybody accepts the idea of natural law, to somehow make it a positive declaration of the states. But nevertheless, those were the same values that were before reaffirmed by natural law. And now family, parental rights, basic freedoms, property were reintroduced in the positive law sphere by human rights. But once a man takes over the power to declare the basic rights, he is tempted to change it. And it is our role as lawyers to bring back this original meaning of human rights that serves society by examples of cases where we can easily see how much harm is done to the families, to people, when those basic rights are violated. And in cases of child protection services, it is very easily to be seen because the harm is done to children, even to those that are unborn, like in the case of Celia Garmo, who was accepted in Poland and granted asylum, political asylum status in Poland, because her child was to be taken from her, and the decision of Barnevernet was issued, was prepared before little Ira was born. And as we presented it to the Polish government, we said it might be the only case in Norway where the legal status of this child was recognized before she was born. That's the role of the lawyers now. To combine all those levels, strictly legal level, cultural and social level of argumentation, in order to bring back the natural status of rights.
Interesting. In the media in my country, Norway, especially in the liberal Christian newspaper Vårt Land, there's been a huge attack recently about me and my relationship with Ordo Iuris, and they also mentioned ADF. It seems like that is what brings fear to secular society. It is the alliance between church and the legal profession. Is that something that goes on worldwide, or is this something specific for Norway? Paul.
I would probably generalize it a little bit and say that one of the very clear things that we see today in 2021 is the attempt to shut down any conversation, any debate, any opposing views, not by engaging with the substance of them, not by, for example, hearing what Jerzy said and then debating that in a meaningful way, but trying to shut those things down through this guilt by association and what we're now calling cancel culture, which is I don't want to talk about what you want to talk about. I just want to label you as an extremist, a bigot, whatever. I want to cancel you, I want to cut you off. And one of the primary ways that we're seeing that play out is what I would consider to be an increasingly ludicrous sort of web of connections that they're trying to establish that tries to make out that there's some terrible, nefarious network or scheme or what have you, which is ludicrous. And I don't know if it pertains simply to relationship between lawyers and the church, but more broadly just this idea of attempting to shut down debate through this tactic, I would say, of cancel culture, of guilt by association.
Jason.
Especially in Europe, we are often criticized as people of the church or faith-based activists. Nevertheless, as lawyers, we never introduce arguments from the field of religion into the argumentation before the court, in the legal analysis. It is an element of the cancel culture, yes. But we have to recognize that we have at least two European traditions of constitutional traditions of relations between the faithful, the religion, the church, and the civil law, and the state. We have the conservative, old tradition of autonomy and cooperation that is introduced into the constitutions of many European countries, Spain, Italy, Poland, Hungary. And we have the laïcité tradition, the French tradition, post-revolutionary tradition of separation, of very strong separation between the state and the religion and the church. And as the Article 4 of the Treaty on European Union stipulates the protection and respect for the cultural and constitutional identities of countries across Europe. We need to recognize those two traditions at least. So it is hard to criticize organizations from countries like Poland, Hungary, Austria that cooperate with citizen organizations, churches, that serve the same aims, that pursue the same goals of protection of human dignity, of basic freedoms. And of course, I understand that there is a second tradition, a Scandinavian French tradition of separation. And it is a matter of debate. Somehow and sometimes we will meet in the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights to debate how far and how strong separation is acceptable. Because after some threshold of separation, the faithful and the churches are persecuted. And we all experience that in the third tradition, now gone, the communist tradition, where the separation was total. And the separation was a separation by elimination. And that's why the Central European countries, the Intermarium region, tend now to accept this autonomy and cooperation tradition of the church and the state. And that's why organizations like Ordo Iuris, Aliance Defending Freedom, I believe, all accept the society as it is, with all different organizations, with churches among them.
Exactly. There seems to have been many verdicts in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights that have been in favor of families versus Norway, especially in cases around barnevernet. And that has led to several new decisions by the Norwegian Supreme Court, which for at least several years has not even touched the issue of barnevernet. Would you say that it's well-founded that some of us are optimistic now, that we see a positive trend in European law, in Strasbourg especially, or is it limited to certain areas only? What would you say about that, Paul?
I'm an optimistic person, so
Amen to that.
And also, I suppose, I have to be realistic. So I think the answer is probably both. In the specific area in relation to barnevernet, there have been, not only at the European Court of Human Rights, but also the Council of Europe, its parliamentary system, increased scrutiny on barnevernet, on this, as is this overreach, this incredible overreach of state control and state interference into the private family lives of their citizens. And I would say that's only just getting going. It is certainly not crystallized and established, and we've had some good decisions, most notably the Strand-Lobban decision. But there's a long way to go, and there's a long way to go in terms of implementation of these decisions as well within the Norwegian system. And implementation from the European Court of Human Rights is always a challenge, because the court can issue its judgments, but they're only important and effective insofar as the member states then go ahead and enforce them. And so with this case, with Strand-Lobban, this young mother who went to barnevernet in order to seek help to raise her young child, had the child taken away from her, had the child kept away from her with decreasing visitation rights over a period of a decade. The court found that Norway had violated the European Convention on Human Rights, but we're still now struggling to see that being meaningfully enforced through policy and legal change at the national level. So I would say on this one particular area, we've certainly seen some positive steps, not only within the law, but also within the media. I remember 2-3 years ago on the BBC, I think the headline was Norway's Hidden Scandal. And it was a full feature article about this. You know, I think a number of years ago, an article like that in a place like the BBC would have been considered impossible. So I think the tide is turning, and certainly in the UK context too, for the last 2 weeks, the Sunday Times, which is I think probably our most established, biggest paper, has been reporting articles along similar lines, reporting on how children have been taken from their parents. There was an article last week about a chronic lack of experts who give x-rays, radiologists, within the health system has led to misdiagnosis of what was being considered to be injuries to children. And it was just a misread of the x-ray, and children have been taken away in alarming numbers from parents. And this is now being reported in the national press as a scandal. And so, again, that was unquestionable, unthinkable a few years ago. So definitely positive steps, but I would say a very long way to go.
And I'm very optimistic as well. And at least for two reasons. We have those decisions of the European Court of Human Rights that are influencing the public debate and the public awareness of problem in Norway, Germany, United Kingdom, the Netherlands. And we have minorities in those countries that do not accept the system as it is. And mostly ethnic minorities, religious minorities, who confront the status quo by raising those issues to the international courts and to the public debate and to the awareness of the society. And what we now know is that 44% of Norwegians tend to declare that there is something wrong about barnevernet. And when we started our report on barnevernet in 2017, when I arranged a table of experts in Oslo, I had to guarantee that it is up to the Chatham House rules, because nobody wanted to participate if we declare who was the participant. The situation changed, and now the debate is much more open, and there is much more acceptance, I believe, in Norway for the idea of reform of the system. Maybe not yet in line with the orders of with the decisions of the Strasbourg court, but with time, I'm very optimistic that this proper model, as it is declared by the court, this model of the family, of the natural, fundamental unit of society, will take over also in the culture, on the social level, and then it will be implemented into the domestic law as well.
I would say that the fundamental question behind all of this is it's the title of a book, and I think it's the question that I think frames the argument, which is, to whom do children belong? That is it to the parents or is it to the state? And depending on how one answers that question, everything else sort of flows from that. And the overreach of some of these protection agencies is one fundamental and perhaps the most extreme example of essentially answering the question, well, the children belong to the state. But it's certainly not the only area. I would say that there's at least, maybe you can think of more, but there's at least 3 other categories of challenge as we're thinking about family rights and parental rights in Europe. There's the challenge of being able to set up educational establishments outside of those run by and controlled by the state. So whether that is, for example, home education, which is very common in some countries, but very hard in many European countries. It's illegal in Germany, it's practically illegal in Sweden, and it is regulated out of existence in other countries. And then being able to set up private Christian schools, for example, faith-based schools, also extremely difficult. So I would say that is a major area of challenge and concern. Second area is, okay, if parents send their children to the public schools, to the state schools, do they then concede all claims and all rights over the children once they're in those environments? Are they just giving them over to whatever the schools teach? So this whole idea of what's called nowadays comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, which is infiltrated the curriculum of many countries, and parents have no control over what their children are being taught. So they think they're sending their children to school for maths and science and whatever else, geography. And the children are being indoctrinated with things that nothing really to do with educational value, but just pushing a certain worldview. And then the question is, well, what rights do parents have to withdraw their children, to opt them out of that, or to challenge this curriculum completely? And then the third area where, unfortunately, the UK is leading on this globally, I would say, certainly in what's hit the headlines, is to what extent parents are able to have a say or even have the rights over medical decisions affecting children as well. And we've seen a number of tragic cases in the UK, Charlie Gard, Alfie Evans, to name but two, where both of these children, our National Health Service, one of the largest in the world, had said that these children were terminally ill, they were going to die, and the parents in both cases wanted to withdraw their children and seek treatment elsewhere. And both sets of parents were denied that opportunity. And again, it drives home this question, to whom do children belong? Is it that Alfie Evans, does he belong to his parents and Charlie Gard, or to the NHS? And so
National Health Service.
The National Health Service. So we have this one category of the Barneveret type cases, but it's just one. We've got the educational, the medical, and then what's going on in the state schools. So fighting a lot of battles on a lot of different fronts as we think about protection of the family.
What we can add is that, of course, we have to fight those battles on the international level, on the level of culture, social debate, public debate. But what we can also do is to establish safe havens in some of the countries. And that's, for instance, what we are doing now in Poland, trying to secure the possibility to find protection, also legal protection for families from all over Europe in Poland. Families confronted with lack of home education, with comprehensive sexual education obligatory, that became obligatory in some of the countries, and also families confronted with this denial of their rights on the medical level. And more families now, from Norway, even now it is something like 20 cases going on in Poland with Norwegian families trying to secure protection, legal protection for themselves in Poland, asylum protection or other status. There are Germans, Belgians who travel to Poland in order to find a protection against this overuse of state and governmental power over their family and their life. That is something new from our perspective, but it might be a domestic example for the international level as well, and this kind of a precedent case I mentioned before, to form the public awareness of the need to provide protection of basic rights to the families.
Exactly. Now, to both of you, when I meet with secular proponents of this new ideology in my country and other places, and pose the question that you posed, who do the kids belong to? Then they will say, children belong to themselves. What would you say to that?
Well, it hits on a theme that, again, ripples through a lot of the different things we're talking about, which is what would be considered child rights or children's rights. And it's a very difficult thing to talk about in a way, because for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that is the document that's been signed by more countries than any other in the world. It's largely respected text, and that's what introduces this idea of the best interests of the child, although you can trace it before that treaty. No one is, or certainly I'm not, denying in any way that children, in a sense, are rights holders, and that we ought to be serving their best interests as parents. I think that's fundamentally clear. But you have to then take it back a step and say, but who gets to determine who gets to decide what's in the best interests of the child? So it only pushes the question back one stage. And is it the state that gets to decide that, or is it a loving parental family unit? And I think that what we're seeing happen across the Western world is children are being pitted against their parents, with the machinery of the state getting to drive a wedge in between these two groups and being able to determine and essentially play referee between them. And that's what's driving a lot of the breakdown that we see within the court system. So of course there are tragic, sad examples of abuse that we ought to take seriously. And I don't think anyone is arguing that parents have an absolute blank check. Right, of course they don't. But the question of when and how and to what extent the state interjects itself in that family unit and in that relationship, and then pits the children against the parents and puts itself in the decision maker who gets to decide. That's what we're talking about here, and that's one of the major challenges.
Exactly.
The major role of parents is to socialize the child, to introduce the child into the society, to teach her or him how to execute his rights, how to use the rights that are guaranteed by the society, that are natural rights, and those that are granted to them by the society. And this process of socialization, of introduction of a child into the society, this process of growing up a child is guaranteed to the parents by natural rights and by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by all the human rights system documents. And the right of a child to make use of his rights should be proportional to his or her ability to make use of the rights accordingly to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And also the parental rights, from this point of view, are guaranteed and are reaffirmed by this human rights system in order to fulfill the parental responsibility to provide the child to the society as a free man, not grown out by the state, but by the family. So to underline that the state is the secondary community after the family.
Exactly, exactly. I've been involved in a couple of cases the last month in Norway. A mother with a son who has speech impediments and cannot speak himself. But in court, the official barnevernet representative for this boy said verbatim that this boy says verbatim, "I do not want to live with my mother." When I testified on the stand, I asked the question, how is that possible to make that verbatim? They said, that's a good point. So they're using the governmental representatives to decide for the child. So it's the children of the state. It's shifting. So we have to stand up against that. Now, my country, which I love, I want to come clear and say that, I'm proud of Norway. With all these battles, we still have a great country, and I speak with the great appreciation and live there with my family with great joy. However, Norway has a lot of money, and the Norwegian money to the European Union, to 27 member states, is given by the European Commission back to Norway to allocate and distribute to civil organizations in the nations of Europe. 15 European nations have ratified this, but 12 are refusing because the Norwegian funds are used to finance barnevernet, the Pride movement, and such things. So it shows that there is a growing awareness in Europe about the ideological attempts, even politically. It's not just in the judiciary,
also shows the challenges of our organizations, because these so-called non-governmental organizations that receive tremendous amounts of funding from the taxpayer. We're dealing with private funding, private donations, people who are giving of their own volition, not having it taxed from them. Many parts of it carved off to bureaucratic machinery and then recycled back to causes or groups that have a complete disconnection from the taxpayers who gave the money to the state in the first place. So that's the cycle that happens not just in Norway, but it happens across the world. And at the moment in the UK, there's a huge backlash against this group, Stonewall, who have for many years been at the forefront of pushing for the LGBT movement in the UK. And they receive millions of taxpayer funding to lobby the government. So they receive money from the government to lobby the government. And then the real kicker is that they then charge the government and the various departments of the government to receive awards and status from Stonewall to show that they are an equal employer, that they are promoting LGBT rights. And so it's a great setup if you can get it. You know, if you can get money from the taxpayer to lobby back and can charge the government in the process, you know, it's ridiculous. And I think it just shows how on a lot of these issues, how the scales are completely tipped in one direction. Because if these organizations went out and actually tried to earn the money that they make by winning the hearts and minds of their supporters like we do every single day, I'd love to see how they do with that.
And this model is being reintroduced on the European Union level with, for instance, ILGA Europe being financed by the EU to lobby EU institutions. But as to the Norwegian grants and Norwegian funds, that was a major problem in Poland. After the collapse of communism, there was no civic society in Poland besides of solidarity movement. And in this vacuum, George Soros founded organizations entered. And numerous non-governmental organizations were constructed by the George Soros affiliates. Afterwards, they were granted, in fact, the organization founded by George Soros himself was granted the possibility to distribute Norwegian grants in Poland, the Fundacja Batorego. And it is understandable that after 12 years, after the collapse of communism, this way of distributing only grants for civic society constructed absolutely artificial NGO sphere in Poland. And new NGOs were emerging from the early 21st century, mostly pro-family, pro-life organizations, church-based, faith-based organizations, privately donated. Just a few years ago, they all organized themselves in the Confederation of Non-Governmental Initiatives. And one of the first documents issued by the Confederation was the analysis of the distribution of Norwegian grants. And it showed that most of the grants that were designed to officially to support development of civic initiative were fueled to Warsaw, to the capital city, not to those areas where non-NGOs were active. And most of them were transferred to very radical left organizations that were fighting the church, that were fighting conservative cause. So no balance of that was secured. And it started the huge reform performed by the government in Poland a few years ago in order to provide the counterbalance of NGO funding with a transparent structures of the governmental support for NGO organizations. And of course, still there are organizations that are absolutely privately funded, as Ordo Iuris, some pro-life, pro-family organizations. But this is a way how some balance to this civic society sphere was reintroduced during the last 6 or 7 years, but still a lot more is to be done, and Norwegians are not very ready, not very much ready to discuss this topic with the Polish government.
Well, I have 2 more questions for you both. The first I will state, and then the second we'll finish off with. But between the first and second, I would like Pastor Reverend Christopher Purcell to give your comment and challenge to the legal minds up here. But before that, what are the gravest dangers for the family and life protection in Europe today, Paul?
I mean, I'll probably just recap some of the things I've touched on just from my perspective. One is a complete devaluing of the role of the family and the role of marriage within society. 2, a complete lack of teaching and positive vision set forth by the church and by various Christian communities. And 3, the deliberate legal ways in which marriage and the family are being attacked and undermined in a very systematic way through the various countries of Europe and at the international level. And these are all sort of, I think, playing into the position that we find ourselves in today. And I think that we have to recognize that this is a significant uphill battle, because this hasn't just happened overnight. This has been happening for decades. And a lot of the groups that Jerzy has mentioned, these are entrenched, they're embedded, they're part of the system. They're getting funded by the bodies that they're then being called to lobby. They're writing the drafting papers and the briefings and the policy for these bodies. And again, this is not new. This has been happening for a very long time. And so I think that one of the things that I remind our team and myself is just a question of timescale. We can't expect to just turn up and see all these challenges and then, oh, good, we solved it. Now what do we do? This is a lifetime endeavor. And I think that as the ambassador said earlier, organizations and groups will always be needed, because to an extent the family is always under threat, always under pressure. And we see that so clearly in Western Europe coming from, sadly, the apparatus of the state itself in many instances. So that wasn't one thing, it was several, but they are intertwined, I think.
Thank you for that. Jerzy, what do you see as the gravest danger?
In the time of collapse of traditional intermediary bodies, like religious communities in secular Europe, this loneliness of a man before the state grows as a basic danger of overusing of the power of the state. And this is the role of the NGOs, of the churches, of the religious communities, to reintroduce this intermediary level, those intermediary bodies, associations, organizations that tend to be on the international level, on the domestic level, tend to limit the power of the state, to protect the family, protect the family, stand in front of the governmental officials in order to grant protection to the basic freedoms of the members of the society. But in contemporary situation on the international level, we have also 2 other major threats. The first one is that this loneliness of a man against a state, very traditional picture of liberal theory, becomes a loneliness of a man before international corporations. With a state becoming sometimes an intermediary body that protect or may protect with a domestic level regulations the basic freedoms of the man, for instance, freedom of speech, against Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. And the second issue is the deregulation of the sources of the international law. When we are invoking Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when we are invoking basic notions of human rights system that, as we mentioned before, were constructed to introduce into the positive law, natural law. We often see what is done today without consent of the nation states. That was the source and the legitimization of the international law till 90s or beginning of our century. More and more soft international law, more and more norms are introduced as standards, officially non-binding, practically much more binding than treaties before. And they all tend to be very radical from a social point of view. They all tend to represent what the radicals from the international NGOs who want to place into those standards without the consent of the nation states. And that is the third tier of the threats that we have to face today.
In fact, let me just build on that, because I think that's a really good point in terms of there's undoubtedly this growing chasm or gap between an individual or a family, let's say, and then decision makers. And so in essence, this is a question of democracy in its very original sense of having a demos and a kratos and the relationship between those in power and those who put them in power, keep them in power. And decades, centuries ago, that gap was quite small, at a local level at least. And over time, that became greater through centralized government. And as Jerzy says, now it's beyond that, because now it's at the level of either mega corporations that have zero accountability or international institutions that have swallowed up the role of lawmaking. And so now the gap is perhaps bigger than it's ever been. And that makes for a very vulnerable situation, actually, when it comes to protection of all rights, including those of the family.
Interesting. Before the final question, and you can think about this, what gives you great hope? I'd like to ask Reverend Christopher Perschel, thank you for being here with us in your role in Vienna, but also Europe-wide. What do you see before us? What situation should you and we as Christians face?
I think a lot of things have been mentioned already, that this is not something that happened overnight. Education doesn't happen overnight. Changing a person's mindset or changing the way a person thinks happens over decades of, if you want to call it indoctrination, that's the way it is, and that can go both ways. And part of the reason we are in the place we are in now is, I believe, is because the church has withdrawn from society. It has taken a approach of we are separate from society, and it comes very much from the mindset of we're living for another world, which is true, but we are still living in this world, and we're actually supposed to take that other world and bring it here. And so I think a lot of this comes out of the church's cowardice and out of its backing away from society and believing they have no power to change society. Now, there are some things that the church probably should not get involved in, but my personal feeling is if we need to change society, we need to retrain Christians. We need to, and I think Paul had mentioned it before, is very rarely do you hear churches teach on marriage or family or sex, education, these things, and these things God has put on my heart very strongly to teach on the role of a man and a woman, the role of children, the role of a healthy family, because when God invented family, he had an idea that was good. He didn't say, I'm sorry, it's a second-class idea. Actually, I think the state is better. God looked at the family and said, it's very good. And when God says it's very good, there's nothing to change about it. And I think that the church has just lost sight of that. That's one aspect, so training and equipping and teaching. The second aspect I think that is critical is hypocrisy. I believe, Paul, you mentioned it. Now, this is one of the issues when you look at church, and of course, you don't hear about all the families that are functioning well, because the media doesn't present that. It presents the one family that falls, or the one pastor that steps out of his relationship and finds another woman, and it's abhorrent to me. But fact is, I believe that creates a view that even the Christians can't get it right. So therefore, we should abandon everything they believe. And so we've kind of created this chasm of society here, church here, and they're actually contrary to each other. Whereas when you look at how Jesus lived, society and church was intermingled completely. And Jesus, with everything he did, changed society. He changed poverty, right? He looked at poverty, he looked at someone who was blind or lame, healed them and reintegrated them into society so that they could work and take their place. And I believe if we can take that kind of vision and mission that Jesus passed on to his disciples when he said, go and do likewise, do the same things I did, is to restore those who are broken to a place of stability, restore those who are lost to a place of being found, restore those who don't have family to a place of seeing that church actually can be family and seeing what real family should look like. Then it creates over time, doesn't happen overnight. It over time creates this, I would probably say, dynamic that cannot be stopped and that will actually infiltrate society. And when it infiltrates society, it changes the way we vote, it changes the way we make laws, it changes the way we approach politicians. Then it's a democracy, and I kept asking myself, who put the state in their place of empowerment? It was the people. And who does the state work for? The people, not the other way around. And that's getting very muddied at the moment in many countries, and in Europe of all the places. I believe it's a real challenge. And here's the if you want, prophetic picture that I believe is over Europe. Europe for many decades and centuries was at the core of mission. If you look at some of the most powerful movements that came in Africa, in India, in China, that was birthed in Europe. There were missionaries who caught God's perspective and went to other nations. And now it's time for Europe to wake up and realize what our history is. And I was criticized openly on public television for saying that Europe has Christian roots. And I was told that that's just not true. I thought, well, at least I think I know my history. So I think it's revisiting the history, and it starts, and God always starts with his own house. He always starts with the church first. And if we miss the memo, then we can't be surprised if in 20 years society's gone down the drain. But if we get God's heart now, I think in 10, 20, 30 years, if we are in it for the long game, which Jesus was in for, then I think society will be able to be brought back around to what it was intended to be in God. So I honor you. I thank you so much for the investment you're making. I am sorry that the churches have delegated that battle to parallel organizations instead of partnering with you and walking hand in hand with you. I think this is a key, is that we as church don't delegate and say, I hope somebody else does it. And then someone does, but actually it was the church's responsibility to stand with organizations like you. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you so much, Christopher Purcell. Touches my heart to hear. I had heard about Christopher Purcell from others, but the first time I really discovered him was when he was leading a huge conference in Vienna, Awakening Europe, together with Ben Fitzgerald. And they brought to the podium the Bundeskanzler, Sebastian Kurz, and the Catholic Cardinal Schonbaum. And I saw the hearts of serving and coming together. So thank you for even being with us today. Now, Paul Coleman, what gives you hope?
Everything that was just said, I think, for sure, so thank you. And I would add one more, which is sort of always the case. If I'm asked that question, or when I travel, or when, in this case, people have traveled here, great source of hope is seeing alliances come together. And in terms of the history of Europe, we know that part of our history is a lot of division. A lot of the history of the church is a lot of division, and we see that playing out through to the present day. So it's always a source of encouragement and hope for me when we see a coming together of allies from different countries, from different backgrounds, from different traditions, who are united for a common cause. And I think that there's actually a lot more of us than certainly would ever be conceded or reported in the mainstream media, certainly than what is currently represented within the elites within society, whether it's politics or law or wherever. But in fact, I think what we represent from the different countries is still representing a huge number of people who agree, who think likewise, and who are building part of a movement that I'm greatly encouraged by. And Ordo Iuris began 8 years ago. We began just before that 10 years ago. And before that, there wasn't these coalitions, there weren't these organizations. So it's getting going, it's getting started. We're at the beginning of it. We're in the first chapter maybe, but it's exciting to see this alliance and this coming together, I think, across the continent.
Thank you so much for that, Paul Coleman. And then to my favorite Catholic, one of the men I know with the greatest faith in God is Jerzy Kwaśniewski. What gives you hope?
You mentioned democracy, and we are not very good at it in the Catholic Church. And when we try with democracy, like in Germany, it doesn't work well. But still, when you mentioned training, teaching, it is what we are doing from the very beginning of Ordo Iuris, of ADF, is many young people, many young lawyers, young professionals are working with us, and then working in a professional field as lawyers, as experts, with this special experience of providing protection to basic rights and values. And that experience was used by us to found a university this year, Collegium Intermarium in Warsaw, with a law faculty on that, that will reintroduce the classical education and the classical values to education of the young generation. As we are meeting today, the candidates for the studies are just questioned by the commission in Warsaw, and first students will be admitted in October this year. The doctoral studies will be available in 4 years from now. The research centers are already enacted, and we are constructing a network of organizations, not only from the Intermarium region, the Central European region, but from across all over the world, in order to provide a specific academic institution for training and teaching, because it is where all revolutions began, and we need academic center for that.
Amen. Well, thank you so much to our audience to have been with us today. And Ordo Iuris has graciously made this recording for our joint efforts. And we want to connect with everyone. Please connect with Ordo Iuris, Aliance Defending Freedom, Kristen Koalisjon in Norway, and other churches that are connected with us in any way or fashion. So God bless you all, and we'll see you around the next quarter.